And I'd like to introduce from the University of Wyoming, Renee LeGree, who's going to share this session.
Thanks, Mike. Welcome, everyone. Good to see you here. This is a really exciting panel session. It's teaching with Mari Sandoz on the High Plains, and kind of dovetailing with some of the earlier commenters and speakers. History should be stories. You know, I do a lot of research in Italy, and Italians don't have a distinction between history and story. It's the same word. And so trying to get our kids interested in history, trying to keep adults interested in history. They don't want theory, they want stories. So we'll hear what these have to say. What I'm going to do today is introduce all the panel members first, and then we're going to go into the discussion. That way I won't have to introduce each one as they come up to the podium. So three fabulous professors here at Chadron State. Mary Clay Jones is an assistant professor of English and Humanities. She's been teaching at CSU for 6 years. She teaches rhetoric and writing, special topics in writing, Native American literature on rotation with Professor Evertson, world literature and theory and criticism. Her students in her writing classes in Native American literature have visited the Mari Sandoz archives at this wonderful facility here. She first learned about Mari Sandoz in her first semester teaching at CSU in the fall of 2017. In 2019, Kurt Kurtbacher asked her to write a paper about Sandoz's novel Capital City, which she presented in a panel with Chris Stenke here. It was a great presentation. And although her research interests veer mostly toward late 19th century British women, not exactly a Sandoz type, but she's currently working on an article-length essay about the heroines of Capital City. And we were talking about this, and yes, get that published. Okay. Marcus Jones is an associate professor at Chadron State College in the English and Creative Writing Department. He taught at Lincoln University before starting at CSU in 2017, where he now teaches writing fiction and nonfiction, or as he says, writing classes across the board. So he first learned of Mari Sandoz when he moved to Nebraska. This is a repeating theme. No one knows about her till they get up here. And this is why we have to really get Mari Sandoz out there. That other pretender, Cather, you know, she gets all the press, but we got to get Sandoz up there at the same level of recognition. So anyway, Professor Jones' novel was an award. His first novel, How the Butcher Bird Finds Her Voice, was published in 2018. The novel is an award winner in the multicultural category of the 2018 American Fiction Awards. He is also twice nominated for the Pushcart Prize. And our final presenter on the panel today is Matt Evertson, who's been teaching in the English and Humanities department since 2001. He teaches American literature and 3 courses on regional studies in the regional studies area, literature of the American West, literature of the environment, and Native American literature. He's occasionally taught Nebraskan land writers sections of the Introduction to Literature course, and a few years ago began emphasizing Nebraska writers in his major writers course. He also incorporates regional authors and regional issues in his eco-composition course and the Home on the Range course, co-taught with several of his faculty members here. So Dr. Evertson grew up in Nebraska and recalled that while having old Jills in the family bookshelf, he never read any Sandoz until he started teaching at CSU. And perhaps it's because Sandoz is like scotch and golf. I mean, you don't appreciate it until you're a little bit older. So his current writing projects include the exploration of the ecological themes surrounding home and homes in the works of Willa Cather, Mari Sandoz, Wright Morris, and other Nebraska voices. And in his spare time, he attempts to write long and short fiction, mostly set in the contemporary West. So these are our panelists, and I'll have them go 1, 2, 3, just like I introduced them, and then at the end we'll open it up for questions. They have questions for you, and I'm sure you will have questions for them. So thank you.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having us. Thank you to the Sandoz Board and Society for organizing this wonderful conference, and thank you to Kurt Kenbacher for inviting us to do this panel. I'm going to give you a short anecdote about my assimilation into the Great Plains. So when we were preparing this panel, Matt Evertson, we had a conversation a couple days ago about what the experience of living on the High Plains is like for a transplant, because he's from Kimball, so he's grown up in this area. He left for a little while. You were born in Rushville? Well, don't stop in Rushville anymore. Go to Gordon. So, I started thinking about that, and it's a strange experience. I mean, this is the smallest town I've ever lived in, but it's the largest town for many of my students. I grew up in South Carolina, so East Coast, Deep South, crowded by trees, people, cars. People who think they're cowboys in South Carolina don't really, I think, understand the meaning. And they're just like dressing up and playing at it. They're farmers. They're not ranchers. They're not cowboys. And I didn't really know the difference until I moved out here. There's a whole lot of stuff that I learned. But anyway, it's been a long, strange journey. The sky gets in your heart and your soul in a way that I can't describe. And no one really understands until they land, like they put feet on the ground here and see it with their own eyes. I send pictures to friends all the time and they're like, I don't understand. That just looks like a bunch of dry grass. And I think, no, but the meadowlarks dip in and out and you can't see them. And then you feel like you're disappearing into the landscape with them. So anyway, I'm going to revise and say that this is teaching with Mari on the High Plains. I haven't actually taught Mari before. I've written about her and read some of her works, but I haven't taught her before. However, I do take my students to the Sandoz archives whenever I can fit it into my classes. So this was a Monuments, Memorials, and Markers class. It's a freshman composition class with a special topics theme. And we were looking at subversive monuments versus very traditional monuments, and like what even counts as a monument, a marker, or memorial, and what are those definitions. And I thought a good way to introduce them into the area was to go read about Mari and her experiences of place, so they could start to get a feel for the things she thought were important in this area. So, but this is Sheldon Curley and Branson Taylor. Sheldon is from Window Rock, Spider Rock, Arizona, and Branson Taylor is from Rapid City, South Dakota. So they aren't from the High Plains either, and they were doing some research here on the history of Chadron State College. And then here we've got Dylan Koretko. I don't know if is he a history education? He may have been math education. Anyway, he was a football player. Colton Alexander and Katrina Rieshling, they were looking through Mari Sandoz's letters to editors. There were some really heartbreaking letters in there. And then somewhere she gets a little cranky with her editors, and it's so wonderful and marvelous. So we had a good time looking at those. And then Dr. Evertson and I took our combined, not all of the students from both of our classes could come, but we did a study away, and we took both of our special topics courses to Mount Rushmore and then to Crazy Horse. And we looked through the whole museum and the bottom of Mount Rushmore. If you go underneath, it is just, well, it's very boring and dry, but there's no mention of the Lakota people at all at Mount Rushmore. Nowhere. They're selling books by Lakota people in the gift shop, But in the museum part itself, it's all a bunch of letters from Congress and senators, and it's about funding. It's pretty terrible reading. Sorry, historians. I need a story. Where's Renee? I need a story to get me into the history. So then we talked about Crazy Horse as a potential subversive monument that's in conversation with Mount Rushmore. Even though the monument is pointing towards where Crazy Horse was murdered at Fort Robinson, so I think that's eventually supposed to be his arm, and he's pointing. And this is a bad picture, sorry. But we sort of talked about what it might mean to design a monument that would speak to the lack of Lakota presence at Mount Rushmore. And then my students designed their own subversive monument. They chose something different, but anyway, so that's one of the ways that I've used some of the things in the High Plains. And then Marcus Jones and I designed a freshman composition, just a regular 135, our basic composition class that all freshmen kind of have to take unless they're placed out of it. We did a Sea Hill prompt, and we came up with it together, and we talked about, well, we give them this little prompt, and we ask that we prepare them and say, if you have allergies to all these grasses, take a Zyrtec, wear pants, bring bug spray, pack light, because we're going to go on a little hike, and a lot of them complain and refuse to get in the grass. But many of them go straight up the hill and sit right on top of Sea Hill. So we leave the classroom, we go to Sea Hill, and we kind of use it as an introduction into writing. So we use the landscape kind of as an actor or as a way to introduce students to form their own stories about their experiences of place. And many of them say things like, I want to come here every week. I need to take a walk every day. It's not that far from the dorms. I mean, these are things that we know, but they have just discovered. And they say, oh, I need to unplug. It's so pleasant. It's peaceful. And so it's a lot of fun when the weather is nice. And here's the prompt. We just asked them to spend 10 minutes in very strict observation, so to pass no evaluatory judgments. Just, 5 senses. I tell them not to eat anything, even though that's one of the senses. I'm like, imagine through your smell what it might taste like. Don't go around licking the trees or, anything like that. Don't eat the mud. I don't know what's in there. Use your imagination. And then they move from the observation to interpretation and use those observations to kind of then start to pass judgments in a Kantian sense. Not like, I hate this landscape, but this landscape made me think X. Okay, so that's how I use Mari's landscapes to introduce students to writing.
I'll add something. Hi. Very informal. Walk up here, just start talking. So I'm Marcus Jones, and I'm a little bit of the redheaded stepchild of this group of professors, since I'm more on the writing side. We don't delve into the literature as much. But as to that last assignment, one thing that, if we're talking about the landscape, the High Plains, Sea Hill's right up there. Once you get up there, it's not that far, but the perspective shifts so quickly. All of a sudden, the flat of the plains just sort of lay out in front of you. And even students who are from the area are sort of caught off guard at that perspective shift. When we're in amongst the buildings of campus, in the trees of Shattern itself, you don't really feel that you're out in the wide open. And so that's one of the things I think about this exercise that really brings students who are either transplants or students who are from the area, all of a sudden gives them a renewed perspective. And I think that's why it continues to work so well. And, as much as they grumble, they like getting out of the classroom. So Dr. Evertson a couple of semesters ago, maybe it's been a couple years at this point, 2019, so pre-pandemic, was teaching English 341, a literature of the West. And the students were working through a lot of pretty difficult readings and sort of coming up organically, if I understand the class correctly, with different themes and different things they wanted to see in stories themselves. And so at some point, Dr. Everson came to my office and said, I have an idea. Do you have time? Would you write a story for my class? If they were to present to you the ideas that they would like to see encompassed in this story. And so I said, sure, let's give it a shot. This email here, themes of tone of abandonment, dirty white Chevrolet, leather cross hanging. It was everything, broad to the specific. Image of cowboy boots should be placed in Shadron. Themes of being suffocated by the wide open landscape. As a creative writer, it's sort of difficult to take on other people's ideas and try to figure out how you're going to incorporate that into a story. And I was sort of struck when we were thinking about how we connect all of this, what we're doing with Mari Sandoz. I was sort of struck with some of Capital City, Mari Sandoz novel, some of her descriptions, because a lot of these descriptions really do sort of play out in Western literature and what the High Plains do. And so I'm gonna read this one paragraph, and then we're gonna, just on these highlighted sections, these three, I'm gonna give short little excerpts from the story that I wrote. And then just sort of talk about it, and Matt may come up here and explain too the process with his students, but their ability then to sort of deal with the literature that they're dealing with, but had a hand in creating it. And then I came back to the classroom several times as the revision process worked out. And then finally at the very end, we had a day where we sort of did a slight workshop, and the students were able to kind of talk about where they saw their elements, how that made the fiction for them come alive. It was a really sort of interesting interdisciplinary assignment. So this is Mari Sandoz. The fall was a long, dry taste of ragweed to the tongue. For weeks, dust lay like fog over the highways, the goldenrod alongside weighed down with its powdering, the sun setting as through smoke. Then 2 days of a leaning wind cleared the air, swept the scattered trees naked as a dead November, and cracked the earth around the new wheat. In the cornfields, the shucking teams moved at a steady walk, with now and then a nubbin clattering desolately against the bangboard. In here, I may have spared you all. There's also about a 13-page section of a description of mud. There's quite a bit of setting as character when it comes to the High Plains, when it comes to what Sandoz is doing. And so, as I wrote this story organically for this class, setting very quickly became a character as well. So this first little scene or section, one student wanted an image of cowboy boots, distressed and dusty with a hole in the toe and blood on the heels. It's very specific. I did what I could. And so this is just a quick section from the beginning of the story. He rocked this particular boot to loosen it. A nail head in the post snagged the soft flesh of his palm. He yanked his hand back to reveal the draw of a red line of blood, a parallel track to the forked lifeline by his thumb. When Osiris got older, he learned these boots pulled double duty. Intended to cap off the butt end of the post and keep rain from creeping into the wood, ranchers also used the boots as memorials to remember a family member or ranch hand or even a favorite cow. But these boots did something else too. They did their job in getting Osiris to remember. And in this story, we're dealing with a very desolate landscape. It hasn't rained in a long time. It's set in Shadron, and there's this exodus at some point where we kind of have to leave. And so the students really, the more and more I talk to them, they love this idea of being suffocated by a wide open landscape. And if we kind of sort of talk about being transplants and from the East Coast, it's interesting because I hear from some of you all who have grown up out here that being in a holler in the Appalachian Mountains is suffocating. having all that leaf around you is suffocating. I don't understand your nods. I have no idea what's going on there. It feels cozy to me. I feel comfortable. It feels like I belong. Out here, I feel I'm wide open. I have no more secrets. In a way, that wide openness is suffocating as well. And so I try to kind of touch on that here with this little section in the middle of the story. Darkness along the horizon stretched out forever in both directions. The sandstorm settled on them before they found any place to ride it out. Clumps of yellow shortgrass dotted the between places where leftover topsoil escaped the prying fingers of the wind next to where the chalky bones of the plains poked through. In all directions, the high tablelands lay barren. The creep of the badlands stole everything, once wildfire after wildfire ravaged the slow-growing juniper in Ponderosa. Their long, charred skeletons tombstoned every ridge. The first, thank you. The excerpt that I read from Mari Sandoz, I feel, here's where you see an overlap on that. Using description, using setting as character. It is part of this landscape in a way that, as much as I want to be proud of my East Coast haulers in the Appalachians, they're not as open as a character. They're much more closed off. And there's just something this wide open landscape does, even for, I think, the creative mind. And then finally, the final excerpt that I'm just going to quickly go over. Again, a very specific sample that the student wanted. A dirty white Chevrolet, a broad-brimmed cowboy hat. There is a cowboy hat, but it's just not in this one excerpt. And then a leather cross hanging from the rearview mirror. And so, there's a lot, too, when we deal with writing, as we look through even from Sandoz to anything that was done in English 341, there's this thing about metaphoric fabric, how you interweave elements through a story and how they come back and sort of remind you and nudge you to think about what had previously happened. And so in this, the leather cross is supposed to sort of at some point make you think about those boots again that kind of started this whole story out. So abandoned in the ditch ahead, a bit of white contrasted against the browns and yellows of the landscape. A beat-up Chevy pickup leaned against the pylon of a cattle grate. The front end disappeared into the shade. The crash of clouds buoyed to the very earth around them, lifted to fill the horizon, and darkness pushed forward. A leather cross hung from the rear view. The old leather cracked and peeled like the leather boots stuck on the fence post trying to flee to the north. Iris looped it free. The stiff leather lanyard froze in an elongated oval. It endured the rigor mortis of time and heat and death itself. So these are just short little examples of this 20-page short story. But the idea here is that the High Plains, Mari Sandoz, this idea of what it's like to sort of teach here, I think we have come up with many creative ways to kind of incorporate place, incorporate it into our classroom. And the students tend to be inspired by place itself. That last day when we kind of finally had this mini workshop with the story, it was really interesting to see the students feel emboldened by having seen their very specific themes and specific wants to see those show up in the story. So, and then with that, I think Matt may add a little bit. I think we were a little bit out of order, but I'll let Matt come up here, or maybe you want me to actually bring you the mic? Okay.
We could do some primary research right now. Why do you all put old cowboy boots on the posts?
There we go. Great question.
Does anybody know? Tim? I had no answer for Marcus either when he was working on that for 341. A couple of years ago, I was asked, or maybe it was just a year ago, we had a meeting in Lincoln and I was asked to do a retrospective on Sandoz that appeared in the Storycatcher newsletter. On the marisandoz.org website, there's an archive of all the Storycatcher newsletters, and they're quite wonderful. They have really good detail, and the stories that have been published in the last few newsletters are really chronicling a lot of the work that's being done by board members and others to promote Sandoz and events associated with Sandoz. some of which I'll mention here in this little spiel. But so I thought it might be helpful to read this portion of the retrospective I was asked to pen. So yes, it begins with the well-trodden story of me being born in Rushville, and they should have a sign in that new museum that says birthplace of Matt Everett. But it's true, the antipathy towards our hometown or where we grew up runs strong in me. All my Sandoz board members know this is a theme with me. But I've grown to love Northwest Nebraska. It's a little bit specific. But yeah, we didn't read Sandoz. My mom would talk a lot about Old Jules, and when I started teaching here, it became pretty clear that my area of specialization, turn of the century, literary realism and naturalism, maybe didn't apply as much. Stephen Crane wrote a great story that's set in Nebraska called The Blue Hotel. He was the subject of my dissertation, but beyond that, not a lot. Theodore Roosevelt, the other subject of my dissertation, spent quite a bit of time in the Dakotas and in the West, of course, and he wrote The Winning of the West, very problematic. But, these are East Coast folks. So I started to reorient my studies towards this. And I also saw the building being built, and I'm like, they have some money. So this is the wagon to hitch to. So this is the summary, okay. Through my association with the Sandoz Society, I wanted to learn more when I started teaching here. I began reading Sandoz and then assigning our works in my classes. The Nebraska Land Authors course was the first one I started offering. The other one that was right away in the catalog that hadn't been taught in a while was Native American literature, so we brought that back. And I started to incorporate some of Sandoz's work in Native American literature. If we have time later, I have some thoughts about doing that now. And started slowly learning with my students more about the regional authors. And I began presenting at conferences on Sandoz and publishing pieces here and there in scholarly journals on Sandoz and Cather and Wright Morris. And my scholarship and research interests evolved from American literary naturalism to more of an ecological approach than these regional writers. Through Sandoz, I began to rediscover the Markville region and started spending more time in Sandhills and thinking about my own relationship with the Great Plains. And with agricultural and ranching and history, along with my students, I became interested in the flora and fauna of the High Plains and began co-teaching classes with my colleagues over in Rangeland and Wildlife Management. Dr. Frank, raise your hands. Kurt, I co-taught a class where's Kurt? Remember when we did Great Plains? I don't know if you have fond memories of that, but kind of miss teaching that class with you. And this led to my explorations of ecology and nature writing and the literature of the West and the indigenous voices of the region. And of the 22 book-length works by Sandoz listed on the Society website, I checked again last night. 14 of them I've been able to sort of foist on my students in my classes over the years. And more importantly, our program revised our catalog a couple of years ago. And so now we have an English Studies major and a comprehensive English Studies major as well, advanced English Studies. And part of that core requirement does include a 3-credit requirement in regional studies. And in that grouping, we have our Native American Literature course, our Literature of the Environment course, and the Literature of the American West course, which used to be called Literature of the Great Plains. Of the courses that I've taught, some of them are in the discipline of English, and I think I'll end with that discussion. But I want to share a few other examples of ways that we've been integrating the work in the curriculum here since I started teaching. So the eco-composition course, that was a good one to point to. We went to Mount Rushmore, and I love the idea of the living classroom. And so Mary Clay's course was focusing on monuments and memorials, and as you were saying, some of the problematic nature of having the 4 colonial fathers right in the sacred land of the Lakota being, carved into the mountain. But then my class, we were focusing on eco-composition, and they were supposed to write papers that related to, that's a really ecological rich area, and the oldest rocks, I think, on the continent are exposed there. So they were writing more sort of ecology type papers. So it's a great way to sort of blend the classes together and have the region be the classroom. And then the Nebraska Land Authors, like I mentioned, and then that's in my Introduction to Literature course, which we all teach. And in that course, you teach, you got to teach some examples of fiction, some examples of poetry, and some examples of drama. So I started using some Nebraska writers, because there are a few good Nebraska writers, prominent Nebraska writers, and each of those drama was always a little bit of a trick there. And then, since then, I haven't taught that course in a while, but I always try and bring a novel into my Introduction to Lit class, and usually it's one of the novels being featured by the One Book, One Nebraska project, to tie it into sort of the state conversation. So this year, it's The Mystery of Hunting's, what is it? Mystery of Hunting's End by Mignon Eberhardt. So we're reading that in Elements of Lit. Has anybody read that book? It'll be interesting. And then last year we did Jonas Agee, The Bones of Paradise. That was the featured book. And then we had her on campus for our Distinguished Writers Series. She didn't actually get to come to campus because she had an injury, so she zoomed in. But she met with my students over Zoom. And in previous semesters, when we have these sort of regional authors, you can oftentimes lean on them and say, hey, we have a class in Chad, will you zoom in or come meet? And so we've been able to do that. Another one that comes to mind is Jeff Lockwood. We did in our FYI class. He's a professor at the University of Wyoming. So one year he's in the creative writing program, but he started off in entomology. So he wrote this book called Locust, and the class I co-teach with Teresa is supposed to be interdisciplinary first-year inquiry class. And so we choose a subject that can kind of be looked at from multiple perspectives, and that book is a really good one because it talks about the Rocky Mountain locust, the locust storms and all that. And so you have the actual science behind it, and then you have the historical records and the people who wrote about it. So, and then he zoomed into our class because he had been at our writing workshop. So we've been developing these relationships with regional writers, and we're doing Literature of the West, I think, next fall. And we just did Environmental Lit this last year. I always try and bring in some of these voices from our region when we're doing these courses. One time we did a novels class, and I focused on World War I, and we had one of ours, which was Willa Cather's Pulitzer Prize winning novel. So that was an interesting one. And then in just a couple semesters ago, fall 2020, we've been switching off on this course called Major Writers, where we get to choose our supposed to be just one writer, I think. But I branded mine Nebraska writers, major Nebraska writers. And so I
did one in her circle.
Okay, there you go. So we really focused, and that was a 400 level course. So it's been integrated in all these courses. And I really like the interdisciplinary courses we've been able to do that aren't necessarily English. Like when we did Old Jules in FYI, was it 2 semesters ago? Teresa. And Teresa's neighbors with a lot of the sites in Old Jules as we were reading it in the classroom, right? And many of our students kind of were from the region as well. So that just excites me. That's all I want to say about that. In this class that Marcus did the story for us, I used the term, it was a story order. They were ordering a story from our fiction writer on campus. So they came up with that list of things. We had been reading, I believe at the time, Annie Proulx. So that might be some of the negative, whatever. The suffocating, was that the term?
Suffocating.
Or the exposure, being exposed, I think is more of the issue there. And then in that class, I also had Dr. Coughlin, who was our poet on campus, come over, and he did a session on Richard Hugo and a couple of other Western poets. Poe Ballantine, our local famous author, came in and shared some of his stories he's written about, I think nonfiction, he's written about the region that got published in The Sun and elsewhere. I think one of the essays won an award or was featured in the Best American Essays like 2 or 3 years ago, right? So he read one of those. And then R.F. McEwen, a local poet, he came and performed some of his poetry focused on the Pine Ridge. So there's just an attempt to kind of beat the drum of regionalism and that sort of stuff.
Thank you very much, you three. But now we'd like to have them ask you questions, as well as if you have questions for them about integrating teaching into and Mari Sandoz together. Because I teach Mari Sandoz in my Women in the West class. There's a section where I assign, there are 5 books that cover different ethnicities, different eras. and the students can pick one of the books, and then they teach that book to the rest of the class. And Mari Sandoz book is always one of the more popular ones that's chosen. So,
Which one?
Old Jules.
Old Jewel.
But this year I'm adding Miss Marissa.
Do your students struggle with Old Jules? Like reading it, just reading it, following it?
We have bright students.
Really? Teresa, is that what we found in the class? We were doing in elements yesterday. We did Mist in the Tall White Tower, if you know. You guys were doing Capital City there. Yeah. And the first thing my students, they're such whiners. It's like, this story is hard to follow. And I've found that with the Sandoz works, they are the kind that are really rewarding upon rereading, and that's maybe not the most appealing things to students.
I think since in Wyoming we still have a lot of students who come from ranching families that have been in the region for a long time, they kind of relate to the fact that this is a history of people who come to the region, and then the generations after that. In a Women in the West class, they also really twig on the domestic violence, and they find that really disturbing. And so we have some good conversations about that. Yeah, the language is a little bit difficult for them, but compared to the other books that they're reading, I don't think it's any more difficult. And I encourage them just to kick it up a notch. They're here to learn.
I actually have a question for Courtney. Is Courtney Kuba? Where is she? Is she not? Oh, poor Courtney, I just called her out. So I did, in my Native, I forgot to include a picture of my Native American literature students in the Sandoz archives, because apparently we have prints from some Lakota paintings that feature in Black Elk Speaks. And so that was really cool to take my students just right below us right here downstairs and look at some of those prints enlarged on a larger scale and really look to see Black Elk's description of certain battles, massacres, if you will, blown up a little bit bigger for the students to see. They really enjoyed seeing that.
Have you ever addressed sacred places on the prairie? I mean, we're talking about the Sandhills, but the Sandhills butts right up next to, the Black Hills and stuff, but sacred places in this whole area.
Kind of, sort of.
I'm just curious.
So we did talk about, we've talked about prayer bundles before, because even around Mount Rushmore, even though there's nothing official at the museum, there are prayer bundles in the trees surround, like in the local hikes nearby. And I actually had what's her last name? It's a very common last name. Poirier. French fur trade Lakota family. That was Katrina, and she wanted, her grandfather told her about the treaty tree, and there's a marker, but she could find no information about it. But also it was a freshman level course, and I don't know how much she dug into it, but she talked about it as a sacred space that needed more excavation and promotion. So yeah. Do you want to talk about sacred spaces?
So bad, big bad. And that's her grandpa.
Oh.
But anyway, that's interesting. I just was thinking about the memorials and markers because the treaty tree and all that. And so we did the presentation. When I say we, the committee that's been working on the land acknowledgement statement, the Indigenous Reconciliation and Recognition Committee, gave a presentation a year or two ago at the Center for Great Plains Studies called In the Shadow of the Sacred. And it was all about sort of being in our area and being so close to Pahasapa and the sacred lands of the Black Hills, but also a contested land. And then the presentation I gave in Portland a couple months ago at the Association for Literatures of the Environment conference, the title was The Contested Commons, Traditional Ecological Knowledge and Reconciliation Efforts in the Fort Laramie Treaty Lands. And we have been revisiting this idea that we are, and see, are the administrators here? We seem to be in violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty. You know, the Supreme Court ruled on this. And so we have been, I don't know if that gets to the spiritual aspect, but we've been kind of addressing that. And then we'll be reading Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass in my environmental, or in the capstone class starting next week. And we just read it in Environmental Lit. And it has a lot of this emphasis on these sort of ritualistic and sacred elements blended with science and things like that. And so that has been an area that I have sort of got, and traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous ways of knowing are really the hot trends right now in environmental studies. So in that way.
Okay. I was just curious.
I just wanted to comment, rapidly urbanizing population across the country. Every student you produce, who graduates, goes on, who understands something about the place out here, the landscape. There's one more American, one more citizen who might see something as they drive between Omaha and California, rather than, who might shut off the television or the whatever you call it in the van, so the kids have to look out the window. So I really congratulate you on what you're doing and in relationship to the environment. It's a great, missing part of our education across the country, whether it be in the East, which can be very suffocating for people. With a very good friend who cannot stand driving East, particularly in Massachusetts and New England, where they've got the trees on both sides of the road. You go crazy. What's behind this? So I appreciate it. Thank you.
I just wanted to address Matt's, I'm sorry, are you getting somebody else?
It's okay.
Matt talking about the difficulty with trauma when you're teaching that introductory class. I just want to throw out there that we had a really great playwright here, Maggie Griffith, who wrote a play based on incidents in Chagrin, a black family and a minstrel show coming to town, and all of the blow up from that. And it actually does incorporate magical realism too. It's just a kick-ass play. It is a kick-ass play, and that's what I used in my Elements of Lit class when I wanted to use, a piece of trauma. And then, when a few years after I first moved here, we had the literature, the Festival of the Book, the Nebraska here, and we had several playwrights from Lincoln come, who were published and substantial playwrights. So there are good instances, but I've got a copy of Maggie's play.
What's the title?
It's just amazing. And
What's the title?
What's the title?
I can't think of it
Okay.
right now. It just popped into my mind. Senior moment, but I can't think of the title of it. But I've got a copy of it.
Okay.
And it's just amazing. And it's shallow.
I'll email you.
But it was inspired by her seeing a photograph in the newspaper, an old newspaper, of a black family. And I believe the young woman taught school. And she's like, what was going on with that?
We have time for one last question.
So Matt and I, my first introduction to Mari Sandoz was through our I course, and Matt asked us to read The Vine.
Oh, yeah.
And so teaching a course with someone in literature is very challenging because his way of approaching a piece of work, writing, whatever, is very different than mine as a scientist. And so he comes to class and he's talking about all this symbolism and stuff and like having the students explore these ideas. And at the end, I was like, the only thing that I want to know is what is the species of the vine? It's killing me to death. So we revisit that one all the time, I think just because he likes me making fun of him for looking for all the symbolism of colors in the vine. And all I want to do is still know what the species is.
Well, yeah, have you give the last word.
Well, I don't really want the last word. But I'll respond to the students who do leave here. There is something so inspirational about this space and about the classes and when you're in a creative writing classroom and continue to see the same elements creep up in students, whether they're transplanted from here over and over and over again, the space does sort of become part of you. That I think they can't help but leave this area and take it with them.
Well, thank you. Can we have a round of applause for our panel? Thank you very much.